welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at a text that's, well, pretty much a staple of GCSE English Literature. J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls.
Absolutely.
It's a play that really, makes you think. Even though it was written a fair while ago now, it's just packed with stuff that's key for your exams.
Spot on.
So our mission today is to really get under the skin of this play, the story itself, the big ideas Priestley was getting at, and how to tackle it all in English Lit.
Definitely. And it's worth remembering straight away, isn't it? Even though the play is set in 1912, Priestley wrote it, and it was first performed in 1945, just after the Second World War.
Right, yeah.
That gap in time is really crucial. It sort of gives us a big clue about why he wrote it and what he wanted his audience back then to think about.
Okay, good point. Let's get straight into the story then. It opens with this rather fancy dinner party at the Burlings' house. What's the occasion?
Oh, it's all very celebratory. Sheila Burling, the daughter, she's just got engaged to Gerald Croft. He's from a similar, well-off family, maybe even a bit more established. Mr. Burling, Arthur Burling, he's a successful factory owner, and he's absolutely in his element.
Loves the sound of his own voice a bit.
You could say that. Making these sort of self-important speeches about business, how good the engagement is for the families, merging their interests, that kind of thing.
And his wife's there too?
Sybil, yep, Sybil Burling, very much representing that sort of established upper middle class society. And their son Eric, he's there too, but he seems a bit off, maybe. A little awkward amongst all the celebration.
Right, but this happy family scene doesn't last very long, does it?
Not at all. Just as they're sort of patting themselves on the back, the doorbell rings, and in walks this police inspector, Inspector Goole.
Goole, Goole. Interesting name.
It is, yeah. And he brings some pretty devastating news. A young woman named Eva Smith has committed suicide. Drank strong disinfectant.
Horrible.
Awful. And this news, it just shatters the whole evening, doesn't it? Completely. It's like dropping a stone into a calm pond, like you said. The ripples just spread out, and they start revealing all sorts of secrets and connections.
And it becomes clear pretty quickly that everyone there, the family and Gerald, they all have some kind of connection to this Eva Smith.
Yeah.
Let's start with Mr. Burling's link.
Right. So Burling eventually admits, rather grudgingly, that Eva used to work in his factory.
Okay.
She was actually one of the ringleaders, apparently, in a strike for better pay. Just a small raise.
And Burling.
He saw them as troublemakers, basically. Bad for his profits. So he sacked the lot of them, including Eva. He's very matter-of-fact about it. Just business, Doesn't seem to consider the human cost at all.
Right. Typical capitalist attitude, Priestley might say.
Yeah.
Then we have Sheila's involvement, which seems to come from, well, a moment of pure spite, really.
Exactly. It's quite petty, actually. After being sacked by Burling, Eva manages to get another job in a fancy dress shop called Millward's. Sheila goes in, tries on a dress, sees Eva's sort of smiling maybe, and thinks Eva's laughing at her or looks better in the dress. It's a bit unclear. But basically, Sheila gets angry.
And uses her family's influence?
Yep. Complains to the manager, threatens to close their account, and gets Eva fired. Just like that. A rash, jealous act, as you said, without a thought for the consequences, which were, well, devastating for Eva.
Gosh, this is where things get even more complicated, isn't it? With Gerald's confession.
Yes, because the inspector then mentions that Eva Smith later changed her name to Daisy Renton. And that name clearly hits a nerve with Gerald. He confesses that he had an affair with her the previous summer.
An affair. While engaged to Sheila.
Well, technically they weren't formally engaged then, but the relationship with Sheila was certainly serious. He met Daisy Renton in a bar, felt sorry for her, set her up in some rooms he was borrowing from a friend, basically kept her as his mistress for a while.
Wow. And Sheila's reaction?
Pretty much as you'd expect. She's shocked, hurt. She gives him back the engagement ring. It's a really powerful moment in the play.
Yeah, I bet. And it turns out Sybil Burling, Mrs. Burling, the one involved in charity work, she also played a part. Seems unlikely on the surface.
It is quite shocking because Eva, by this point, pregnant and absolutely desperate, goes to Mrs. Burling's charity committee for help. The Brumley Women's Charity Organization, I think it's called.
Okay.
But Eva, maybe foolishly, uses the name Mrs. Burling when she applies.
Oh, dear. Wow.
Well, it's never fully explained. Maybe a desperate attempt to give her claim more weight, or maybe something connected to Eric. But Sybil Burling is immediately prejudiced against her because of it. And because Eva tells a story that Sybil finds hard to believe, especially about the father of the child.
What does Sybil do?
She uses her influence on the committee to have the claim rejected. Turns her away. Coldly. Her class prejudice just completely blinds her to the fact that this is a young woman in genuine, desperate need.
Unbelievable. And the identity of the father. That's the final piece of this awful puzzle, isn't it? Is the Burling's own son, Eric.
Precisely. Eric's been getting increasingly agitated throughout the inspector's questioning, and finally, he breaks down. He confesses that he met Eva, or Daisy, probably in the same bar Gerald met her.
Right.
He was drunk, forced his way into her lodgings. Essentially, it sounds like assault, though the language is a bit veiled. He got her pregnant.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And then he admits to stealing money from his father's business, from the office, to try and support her. But she refused to take more stolen money when she realized.
So his actions show another layer of exploitation, really. That power imbalance between classes and between men and women, too.
Absolutely. It's all laid bare.
So after all these revelations, the inspector gives them a piece of his mind, doesn't he? Delivers a really powerful speech.
He does. It's the climax of his interrogation. He basically tells them straight out how each one of them, through their selfishness, their thoughtlessness, their greed, their prejudice, they all helped to kill her. He emphasizes that we don't live alone, that we're all interconnected, responsible for each other, members of one body, he says. And he warns them that if people don't learn that lesson, they'll be taught it in fire and blood and anguish, which, for the 1945 audience, would obviously bring the two world wars to mind.
Chilling stuff. Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, the inspector leaves. What's the immediate reaction? How does the family respond?
It's a real mix, actually. Sheila and Eric are clearly distraught. They feel genuine guilt, real remorse for what they did. You sense they've been properly shaken up by it all.
But the older ones?
Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and Gerald too, after a brief moment perhaps, seem more concerned about the potential scandal, how this might affect their reputation, Burling's knighthood prospects, the business merger. There's a sense of relief that the interrogation is over, almost like they want to sweep it under the carpet.
But hang on, their relief doesn't last long, does it? Because Gerald starts to have second thoughts about the inspector himself.
Exactly. Gerald starts wondering, was he a real police inspector? He seemed a bit odd, knew a lot, didn't follow normal procedures. He nips out and finds a policeman on the street who says there's no Inspector Gould working at the local station.
Yeah.
Then Mr. Burling, getting hopeful now, rings the chief constable, Colonel Roberts. And Roberts confirms it, no Inspector Gould on the force.
So relief all round for the older generation and Gerald.
Oh, massively. They start thinking it was all a hoax, a practical joke maybe, that maybe nobody died at all. They start laughing, congratulating themselves on figuring it out.
And Mr. Burling goes even further, doesn't he, to try and completely disprove the whole thing.
He does. To be absolutely sure, he calls the local infirmary, asks if a girl has died there recently, suicide case, disinfectant.
And the answer?
The infirmary says no suicide case like that admitted recently. So they're convinced it was all fake. Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, maybe she wasn't even one single person. They think they're off the hook.
But then the phone rings. One last time, ending the play on a massive cliffhanger.
The ultimate twist. Burling answers it, listens. His face changes. He tells the others. That was the police. A girl has just died. On her way to the infirmary. Swallowed disinfectant. And a police inspector's on his way to ask him questions.
Wow. So it is real after all, or about to be. Leaves them completely stunned.
And us, the audience, too. Total shock and uncertainty. Did the first inspector know this would happen? Was he some kind of spirit, a ghost? It's deliberately ambiguous.
Incredible ending. Okay, so that's the plot laid out. Now, let's dig into some of those big ideas Priestley explores, starting with guilt and responsibility.
Yeah, this is absolutely central, isn't it? It's not just about, feeling a bit bad for something you did wrong. It's about truly accepting the consequences of your actions.
Both personally and socially.
Exactly. Both on a personal level, what you did to Eva, and as part of a wider society. Priestley really hammers home this contrast between the younger generation, Sheila and Eric, who actually start to understand their part in it and feel genuine guilt. And the older Burlings who just can't or won't accept any real responsibility. They're too busy trying to cover it up.
And the inspector makes it really clear that admitting your part is crucial, doesn't he?
He does. For him, acknowledging guilt is the absolutely necessary first step towards any kind of change, any improvement in yourself or society. Priestley shows us that guilt isn't just individual, I did this specific thing, but it's also collective.
Right. They all played a part.
They all played a part. They share responsibility as members of a community. And that final phone call, wow, it just slams home the idea that you can't escape the consequences. If you refuse to take responsibility, reality, or perhaps something else will force you to confront it.
It's really striking how Sheila and Eric seem to have this sort of awakening, whereas Mr. and Ms. Burling just dig their heels in.
Huh.
What about Gerald? Where does he fit?
Gerald's interesting. He's kind of caught in the middle generationally almost. He does show some remorse, especially when he talks about Daisy Renton. He seems genuinely upset for a bit.
Yeah, goes for a walk.
Exactly. But as soon as he gets the idea that the inspector might be fake and there might not be a public scandal, his regret seems to, well, evaporate pretty quickly. It suggests maybe his understanding of responsibility is a bit more superficial, tied more to social appearances and consequences for him, rather than genuine empathy for Eva.
That makes sense. Okay, another really important theme, maybe the driving force behind the inspector's visit, is the tension between capitalism and socialism.
Definitely. You can absolutely read the inspector as embodying socialist ideals. He's constantly questioning the self-interest, the lack of compassion, the exploitation he sees in the Burling's world, which is fundamentally a capitalist world.
He's showing the human cost of it all.
Precisely. Especially its impact on the most vulnerable, the working class, people like Eva Smith who have very little power.
And Mr. Burling and Gerald are firmly in the capitalist camp, aren't they? Presented that way.
Oh, absolutely. They represent that mindset where profit, business growth, personal gain, lower costs, and higher prices, as Burling says, come first, even if it means treating workers badly, like Burling refusing that tiny pay rise.
So Eva's tragedy becomes a kind of symbol.
Yeah, a symbol or a case study almost of the human cost of that kind of unchecked capitalism, where people are just seen as cheap labor, not individuals. We know Priestley himself was a committed socialist, and this play is a really powerful way for him to critique what he saw as the moral failings of the system.
It's striking again how the younger and older generations view this so differently by the end.
It really is. The older generation, especially Mr. and Mrs. Burling, they cling on to what Priestley presents as this outdated, self-serving, purely capitalist view. Whereas Sheila and Eric, they start to question it. They show more empathy towards the workers, towards Eva.
Eric even challenges his dad directly, doesn't he?
Yes, quite early on about the strike. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? He seems to lean much more towards a fairer, maybe more socialist perspective on workers' rights by the end.
Okay. Connected to that, obviously, is the theme of class in Edwardian society.
Hugely important. Priestley paints a really clear picture of the rigid class hierarchy back then. You've got the upper class or upper middle class, like the Burlings and Gerald, holding the power and influence. Then the middle class, and then the working class, represented by Eva, who have very little power and are much more vulnerable.
And the Burlings are very conscious of their status.
Oh, deeply ingrained in their upper class sense of entitlement and superiority. It dictates how they treat people they see as beneath them. And actually, how they treat their own children, too. They still see Sheila and Eric as kids who need to be told what to do.
And Sybil Burling's views on class seem particularly rigid and, well, prejudiced.
They really are. That moment when she talks about Eva coming to the charity, she simply cannot believe that a girl of that class would have moral standards, like refusing stolen money. Her assumptions are entirely based on Eva's social position.
It's awful.
And the play really exposes how the wealthy, people like Gerald and Eric, could exploit and abuse those from the working classes, especially women, often with very few consequences for themselves.
But again, we see Sheila starting to question these class divisions, don't we?
Yes, it's part of her transformation. Initially, she seems pretty wrapped up in her comfortable upper-class world, you know, the ring, the clothes. But through the inspector's questioning, she develops this growing empathy and starts to understand the unfairness and inequality built into the class system.
It's also worth noting, isn't it, that Mr. Burling himself isn't from the same established background as his wife or Gerald. He's a self-made man.
That's a really good point. He's climbed the social ladder, and his obsession with getting that knighthood, his anxiety about social status, his name-dropping, it all points to his own insecurities about class and his desire to solidify his position.
Right. Okay, another layer to consider is gender, the role of women in 1912 Britain.
Absolutely critical. You have to remember, 1912, women didn't even have the vote yet, though the suffragette movement was active. Generally, women, especially in the Burling's class, had a much more subservient role. Their lives were often defined by marriage, by their relationships with men.
And we see that with Sheila and Gerald's engagement at the start.
Yeah, it sets up those traditional expectations. Sheila seems quite dependent on Gerald initially, excited about the ring, playing the happy fiancé.
And we see how gender and class kind of intersect to make Eva even more vulnerable.
Exactly. It's not just because she's working class that she's exploited. Her gender makes her doubly vulnerable to the desires and actions of wealthy men like Gerald and Eric who use their power over her, and also, interestingly, to the judgment and power of wealthy women like Sybil and even Sheila initially, who use their social standing against her.
The play also touches on things like prostitution, doesn't it? The limited options for women.
It does, subtly. When Gerald meets Daisy Renton in the Palace Bar, it's implied that she might be heading towards prostitution out of desperation. It highlights the hypocrisy of society and the very few choices women like Eva had if they lost their jobs and reputations.
But, like with class, Sheila seems to be breaking away from these traditional gender molds by the end.
Definitely. That's a huge part of her character arc. She starts challenging her parents' views, Gerald's attempts to shield her, asserting her own opinions, her own moral compass. She gains independence.
She's almost like a voice for a more modern perspective.
I think so, yeah. Priestley perhaps uses her to reflect the changing attitudes towards women that were happening, albeit slowly, and that he wanted to encourage. And Eva, in a way, becomes a symbol for countless women who were oppressed and exploited by the system at that time.
Okay, and the final major theme we should probably touch on is that really significant generational divide.
Oh, it's stark, isn't it? Priestley draws a really clear line. You've got the older generation, Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and Gerald kind of falls into this camp too by the end.
Yeah, he seems to side with them.
Right. They're portrayed as resistant to change, stuck in their ways, unable or unwilling to truly accept responsibility or learn from the inspector's visit. Their main concern is getting back to normal.
Whereas the younger generation has a completely different reaction.
Completely different. Sheila and Eric are shown as much more empathetic, much more compassionate. Crucially, they seem capable of learning, of changing their attitudes and behavior based on what's happened.
The play also highlights how the parents still treat them like kids, doesn't it?
Yes, constantly. You youngsters, Burling says dismissively. They patronize them, try to protect Sheila from the unpleasant truths, dismiss Eric's concerns. They fail to see them as adults with their own minds.
And the guilt they feel, Sheila and Eric, and their willingness to challenge the parents, that really underlines the conflict.
It really does. Priestley seems much more optimistic about the younger generation. He pins his hopes on them, suggesting they might be the ones to break the cycle, to avoid the mistakes of their parents and build a better, more socially responsible future. Maybe even embrace those socialist ideas of community.
We see that early on, too, with Eric questioning his father about the workers and even about the inevitability of war, which Burling is so confident won't happen.
Exactly. Eric shows signs of dissent right from the start, foreshadowing that bigger split later on.
These themes are so interwoven, aren't they?
Yeah.
Right. Let's look at some key quotes now that really bring these ideas home for people revising, starting with responsibility.
Okay, well, you have to start with Arthur Burling in Act 1, don't you? That famous speech. A man has to make his own way, has to look after himself, and his family too, of course.
Sums up his whole philosophy. Very individualistic.
Totally. And then the inspector directly counters that later in Act 2, doesn't he? Public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges.
Yeah, that's a key line. Straight to the point.
Absolutely. It's the core message, really. That power comes with duty. And then, you can't forget, the inspector's final speech in Act 3, hammering it home. Each of you helped to kill her. Remember that. Never forget it. Emphasizing that collective responsibility.
Chilling. Okay, for capitalism versus socialism, what are some key ones?
Well, Burling, again, early on, talking about the potential merger with Gerald's family firm, working together for lower costs and higher prices. That sums up the capitalist priority pretty bluntly.
And Sheila offers a contrast.
Yeah, surprisingly early, actually, when she hears about her father sacking Eva. But these girls aren't cheap labor, they're people. It's maybe the first sign of her developing conscience.
Nice one. And regarding guilt itself?
Sheila's acceptance is really clear. In Act 2, she says, I know I'm to blame and I'm desperately sorry. It feels very genuine. And Eric echoes that later in Act 3 with real anguish. My God, I'm not likely to forget. The guilt has clearly hit him hard.
Okay. When it comes to class, Sybil Burling's prejudice is just so starkly revealed in Act 2 when she says dismissively, I don't suppose for a moment that we can understand why the girl committed suicide, girls of that class.
Oof, yeah. That quote just lays bare those deep-seated class divisions and her appalling assumptions.
And for gender, maybe Eric's horrible confession in Act 3, where he says, I was in that state when a chap, easily turns nasty and I threaten to make a row.
Yeah, that's grim. It really reveals the power imbalance and the potential for exploitation, how vulnerable Eva was just because she was a woman in that situation.
Horrible. And finally, for the generational divide.
Well, Berling's whole attitude comes across in phrases like, you youngsters, and his belief in the good hard school of experience, implying they know nothing yet.
Very patronizing.
Definitely, but then you contrast that with Sheila's clarity at the end in Act 3. That's the worst part of it. And I've got to remember that the girl's dead and we all helped to kill her, and that's what matters. She gets it. She understands the moral core of the issue.
Unlike her parents.
Right. And remember Eric challenging his father back in Act 1. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? Showing that early difference in perspective. And maybe the most damning line for the older generation's failure to learn is Gerald's at the very end, trying to comfort Sheila. Everything's all right now, Sheila.
He just doesn't get it, does he?
Not at all. He thinks because the scandal might be avoided, the moral implications just disappear. It perfectly encapsulates their inability to grasp the real significance of what happened.
Those quotes are so useful, really pack a punch for essays.
Yeah.
Now, for everyone listening who's, gearing up for their GCSEs, what are some key things to bear in mind when tackling an inspector calls in an exam?
Okay, first things first, make sure you really understand the context. We touched on it earlier, the play being set in 1912, just before World War I, but written and performed in 1945, right after World War II.
That time gap is key.
It's absolutely crucial. Priestley had very specific reasons for writing this then. He had lived through both wars, seen the consequences of the attitudes shown by people like Berling. So always think, what messages is Priestley trying to send to that post-war audience about society, responsibility, inequality, the need for change?
Good advice. And it's important to see the characters as more than just, people in a story, isn't it? They represent things.
Absolutely. Think about how Priestley uses each character almost symbolically. Berling for irresponsible capitalism, Sheila for the potential for change, the inspector for social conscience, and so on. Analyze them as representing different social attitudes and ideologies.
And think about the play aspect, too, the drama.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Consider the dramatic techniques Priestley uses. The single setting, the compressed time frame, the lighting changes, the inspector's mysterious role, those mini cliffhangers at the end of acts, and of course that massive final cliffhanger. Why did he structure it like that? What effect does it have?
And when you're actually writing about the play in an exam,
Always back up your points with specific evidence from the text. That means using well-chosen quotes, like some we discussed, but also referring to specific moments or actions in the play.
don't just drop quotes in randomly.
No, explain why the quote is significant, how it supports your point about a theme or character, and try to think about the impact the play would have had on its original audience, and maybe why it still resonates today, why we're still studying it.
So showing a really strong, detailed knowledge of the text itself is the main thing.
That's the absolute key. It's much better than just memorizing a few quotes out of context. Show you understand how those quotes, those characters, those events all fit together to convey Priestley's overall message and explore those big themes we've talked about.
Some really valuable advice there, thanks. So just to sum up our deep dive into An Inspector Calls, we've walked through the twists and turns of the plot, from the celebratory dinner to that final, shocking phone call. We've dug into the key themes: guilt and responsibility, capitalism versus socialism, the impact of class and gender, and that crucial generational divide.
Yeah, lots to unpack there.
We've also highlighted some really crucial quotes that capture the essence of the play and offered up some essential exam tips for tackling it.
We really hope this session has given you a clearer picture of the play and maybe some useful ways to think about it and approach it for your revision.
Definitely. We'd encourage you to maybe revisit An Inspector Calls, read it again, or watch a production with some of these ideas in mind.
Good idea.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to mull over. Given how relevant this play, written back in 1945 about 1912, still feels today, what do you think are the inspector calls facing our society right now? What are the big issues demanding our attention, our collective responsibility here in the 21st century?
That's a good question to leave people with.
Something to think about until our next deep dive.